Welcome to the Spirit of Work solo episodes of the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If you long to see happier and more humane workplaces and want to reflect on how that could happen, you are in the right place. These monthly solo episodes are based on my book, The Spirit of Work, Timeless Wisdom, Current Realities. The book was written from three complementary sources of knowledge. 1, the sacred writings of the world's spiritual traditions. 2, scientific developments on human behavior and well-being in the workplace. And 3, insightful experiences from business, my clients, and my own work. In each episode, I elaborate on one of the ideas from the book and ask questions to help us all think more holistically about work. Join me as we combine the wisdom of the past and the reading of our current realities to build the future of work. And now for today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of the Spirit of Work solo podcasts, using the language of virtues for building soul-sustaining work decisions. I know it's a mouthful, but I think you will find it easy to digest. Virtues are what I talked about in the last episode a little bit as one of the qualities of the soul that we have to develop. But first, let me explain what a virtue is and how it relates to vice. So a virtue is a quality that we develop and is admired across cultures and civilizations, although it may be expressed differently. Some examples of virtues would be helpfulness, assertiveness, loving kindness, friendliness, strategy. All of those are virtues. They're all qualities of the soul that people often are born with. They have some of them that just seem to be linked to their personality. And then they develop them further and add more on or less on, depending what they pay attention to, because what you pay attention to grows. So if you pay attention to the development of virtues and in mirroring virtues to other people when you see them, then that will grow. So if somebody does something and I say, wow, I really appreciate your generosity, or thank you so much for being helpful, especially when I was tired and not at my best. But that's a way to mirror virtues back to someone. And then they see themselves as being, well, I'm better than I thought, but it doesn't feed the ego. That's the great thing about virtue. Virtues don't feed the ego, they feed the higher self. So they help you to see that you are at one with all of humanity, all of creation, and all of divinity. And at the same time, that you are starting to mirror forth the divine and that you have a long way to go. So it's kind of both at the same time. You can see the start of the race and the end of the race and see it all together. That's what virtue does for you. And as you increase your vocabulary of virtues, you learn to speak the language of virtues, which I will talk to you about, and how important that is for happy and healthy workplaces. And so that is the practice of virtue. Now, the opposite of the practice of virtue is the practice of vice, which is whatever cruel, mean-spirited, or insulting thing that comes to mind that you say, you get a sense of power over when you say it, but it doesn't leave you feeling good afterwards. Often you feel bad about what you said or what you did. But if you keep practicing it, you get very good at vice. And getting really good at vice doesn't develop the qualities of the soul. It leaves a vacuum inside your soul where awful things happen. And so this is the whole piece about the language of virtues and how important it is at work. I have seen it in my own eyes across my many years of working across 4 careers and also working with 500 coaching clients and over 100 companies. So I have seen so many interesting things about how virtue can be practiced at work across industries. So let me tell you a little bit about it. I'm going to give you an example. So a few years ago, I was brought in to work with a scaffolding company that had one of their work sites was completely dysfunctional. And people would either yell or they'd say nothing for weeks to each other. It was pretty awful. And when I went there, I went into the site. Nobody greeted me. The receptionist didn't greet me. Nobody said anything to me. And I tried to initiate a conversation and everybody just glared at me. So I just sat down in a chair and I waited exactly an hour, even though they'd been informed that I was coming. That's how toxic the workplace was. So when finally somebody said, I guess you're here to work with us. And then I said, yes. Could we bring chairs to the center of the room and get started? And so we did, and they were crossing their arms and rolling their eyes and glaring at each other and, looking like no way they were going to say anything. And so I asked them if they would be willing to hear a story that I told about an obstacle I overcame when I was 6 years old. It had to do with riding a bicycle. And from that story, I told them that you can see from a story what virtues people have. And then I passed out lists of the virtues. You can find them online anywhere, just virtues list. And I asked them to identify some of the qualities that they heard from my story of me as a 6-year-old. And so they weren't complimenting me. They were just looking for the virtues in the story. And they were quite interested in doing that because it deflected their hatred of each other in the moment. And after they had done that, I told them I was going to pair them up and that I didn't know the history. So I was just going to pair them up with a random person and that I wanted them to tell a story about an obstacle that they'd overcome or a moment when they felt really proud of themselves. And the other partner would just listen and then, using the virtues list in front of them, identify 2 or 3 virtues that they heard from the story. And then they'd switch. Person B would tell their story and person A would listen and then identify the virtues. I could hardly get them to stop talking. They had so many stories to tell each other. And by the end of that exercise, they were actually, thumping each other on the back and giving each other high fives. And it was a complete about face. So I asked them to think about how they could really each actively promote goodwill in the workplace by thinking about something that they admired and appreciated about one other person at work. And I went around the circle and asked them to say one virtue that they appreciated about one other person. And it wasn't hard for them to come up with examples. After I left, we also did a communication exercise so they could practice saying things in ways that weren't abrasive. But the whole foundation was the language of virtues. So after that, I left. And a couple of months later, I got an email from the person who hired me saying, "What did you do to the people there? They've been so nice to each other. And they're so good with the customers that when customers come in, they want to give us more business. So what did you do so we can replicate it across the company?" That's the power of focusing on virtues. So I'm going to give you a few quotes from the book so you can see what's inside there about virtues. Here is one. Virtues are developed through learning and through practice. Virtues are actually habits. That is, once they're acquired, they become a characteristic of the person. At the heart of the virtue approach to ethics is the idea of community. Person's character traits are not developed in isolation, but within and by the communities to which he or she belongs. The moral life, then, is a matter of trying to determine the kind of people we should be, and of attending to the development of our character within our communities and ourselves. And that was written by Claire Andre and Manuel Velasquez, and for the Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. It's on page 35 of my book. But I think it's a lovely way of looking at virtues as a habit that becomes associated with personality traits. And so, because personality is malleable, it's flexible, you're born with temperament, but personality is what you do with the rest of your life to be the kind of person you'd be proud of. So you can learn the language of virtues by first off having a virtues list nearby and just download it. I have one in my book on page 37, and there are lots of them like gentleness, generosity, friendliness, forgiveness, flexibility, patience, purposefulness, strength, trust, thankfulness. There are so many of them. I have the virtues cards deck, which I got from the Virtues Project. And every day I start my day by choosing a random virtue. And I ask myself, what virtue would be most useful for me today at work? I draw a virtues card, and whatever it says, I reflect on it. And at the end of the day, I think, how did I show that virtue? In what way did I show it, or in what way did I see it in the people I worked with today? So that helps me to develop a character because I'm constantly focusing on the language of virtues. Now, that's one way you can learn the language of virtues and use it in your personal life. And here are some examples of how to speak the language of virtues on page 38. Thanks for staying late to help, Jamal. It was very considerate. There you go. You just use the word considerate. Every morning when I see your smiling face, I feel so joyful. I would like to honor you for your kindness to the team. It matters so much to all of us. So those are just some of the things. You can also use the language of virtues to challenge people and call them to a higher standard. You can say, for example, it's been a hard day. Let's all continue to practice courtesy and respect, even if we're tired, right? So there's the challenge, but it's not done in a way that's condescending or judgmental. Or you could say, before we start today, I'd like to remind everyone about 2 of our core values at this company: honesty with kindness. Feel absolutely free to speak your opinion openly and do it with kindness, right? So now that becomes like a core value that you just keep reasserting. You can start a meeting and say, let's do a virtues pick and see what virtue comes up that we can look for at the end of the meeting to see where it was. Draw a card and something really interesting will come up that you can then focus on at the end and say, how did we show this virtue? So you just pick it in the beginning and then you go forward from there with your meeting. And at the end, you go, how did we show it? And ask people to look for examples. You will find that the goodwill, the encouragement, and the kindness in your workplace just jumps up by 100% or more by starting to use the language of virtues. You can also use the virtues to sustain a good habit. I do that in coaching. So once people have expressed something that is troubling them, and we work to detach the emotion from that particular incident so that they can feel calmer about it, then we do a virtues pick. What virtue could help you to sustain an action or a habit in regard to this particular incident? And they are always blown away by this because it has something really significant for them that they would not have thought of otherwise, because it's a spiritual principle. It's one of the qualities of the soul. So we are not always thinking in that space. So having some tools like having the virtues list and a deck of virtues cards, and there's also an app called Virtues Cards that you can get for your phone. Just shake the app once it's open and a virtue comes up. It's always pertinent because the qualities of the soul are always pertinent, but it seems to be particularly important in the moment when you do the phone shake. So I suggest using those. And here's a final way that you can use the virtues cards or do a virtues pick with the phone. And that is to pick 5. So you pick 5 virtues just randomly. The first one is your core virtue. And then the second one is your guiding virtue. That's going to set you in the right direction. And the third one is your strength virtue. That's the one you can rely on. The fourth one is the one you may find challenging. So you'll need to focus on that virtue to help yourself overcome or meet that challenge. And the last one is the sustaining virtue, which will support you to go the distance as you resolve the problem. I'll just repeat those 5 again. The first one's the core virtue, second one's the guiding virtue, third one's the strength virtue, fourth one's the challenge virtue, and the fifth one is the sustaining virtue. And it is amazing how useful that can be to helping you to solve a problem that you otherwise would not be able to solve. So now that's the first part about using the language of virtues. But now I found something really interesting. I first found it in the writings of the Baha'i Faith, and it's a virtues progression that always follows the same sequence. And then I discovered it in the writings of other religions as well. And I would love to write a whole book about this. And I call it the virtues progression, and it's a decision-making tool. So if you're thinking about solving a problem, the first virtue that needs to be in place is love. If you don't love your work, love yourself, love the work environment, love the fact that you have somebody to work with, you can't experience any love for that other person, you can't go any further. So from love comes truth, because if you love someone, you want to know the truth. If you have a child that's crying and you love them, you want to know the truth about why that child is crying. And you're not going to deny the truth or say that that truth for them doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's an absolute truth, it's what their truth is in that moment. So you seek for the truth. Love and truth are the first 2 parts of the virtues progression. When you have the establishment of love and truth in a decision, then you are likely to have justice, which is what would be fair. It's not fair if it's only truth. It's not fair if it's only love. But when you put love and truth together, the outcome is justice. When you have justice, the outcome is unity. You can start with no love, no truth, and no justice and say, let's just get together and be unified. That is going to fail. I can tell you that right away. Because unity is the outcome of the safety that comes from love, truth, and justice. If you don't feel that you are being treated fairly or that anybody has concern for your well-being, and that the truth has not been sought, then how can you possibly contribute to united thought and moving forward? You can't. So each of these virtues is both a prerequisite and a benchmark at the same time. After unity comes peace. Once you discover any degree of unity, you feel more peaceful. And out of peace comes abundance. And that's why we don't have an equitable distribution of the world's resources, because we're trying to redistribute things before we have love, truth, justice, unity, or peace. And if we had that sequence, we would automatically be moving into abundance. Now, if you have a workplace problem, here's how you can use this progression to solve it. Ask yourself the question, what's missing from the virtues progression? Let's say you've got a situation where somebody refuses to communicate with another person. What's missing? Is it love? Is it truth? Is it justice? Why is that person refusing to communicate? If they don't feel safe and they can't communicate because they don't feel safe, it goes right back to love. If they're worried that if they say something that it will be used against them, it's a concern about justice. If there's unity, but it's not moving anywhere, then you're missing one of the 3, love, truth, or justice. It's not true unity yet. See what I mean? So you can use the virtues progression as a very practical way to solve a workplace problem and come up with a better decision. And here's another way that you can use justice, because justice is really key to all of this. If you want to know if the decision that you've made is just or not, then consider that there are 3 parts to this, which I call the justice quotients. Did you have a diversity of perspectives? If you only have everybody thinking the same way, doing things the same way, and looking at the problem the same way, you don't have a just decision. Did you have diversity of perspectives? Did you consult those who are most affected? That would be the end users, right? In another terminology. Did you consult those most affected? If you're making decisions about people who are in poverty or who are addicts, have you consulted them? If not, it's not a just decision. Are you making decisions about benefits at work? Have you consulted the workers? If you haven't, it's not a just decision. So diversity of perspectives, number one, consult those most affected. And third, all stakeholders have to be present for the decision, because if they aren't, whoever's not there gets blamed for things that are going wrong and gets saddled with work they didn't sign up for, right? So all stakeholders have to be present, consult those most affected, and make sure there's a diversity of perspectives. And that will ensure that the decision is just. If it is just, it will be sustainable. That's the beauty of it. And sustainable, just decision will move towards unity of thought, which will result in peace and abundance. So there you go. Prosperity comes out of the virtues progression. So I hope you found that useful. I particularly liked doing this because I discovered the virtues progression, and it's been there for thousands of years, but I never saw it until recently. And the justice quotients are really necessary for ensuring that whatever decision you make is equitable and that it's going to be sustained and based on virtues, right? So it connects us with the qualities of the soul. I'm going to end with one story, which is in chapter 2. And it's a story that I got from my husband when he first started working as a psychologist. He was working in a prison, and it was one of those really locked down prisons where the most difficult criminals with the worst lives and stories were housed. And he had one guy who was this big, really angry prisoner who was like head to toe tattoos, probably weighed 300 pounds and almost 7 feet tall. And my husband isn't at all the same stature physically. And so he started to talk with this guy about his life, and he found out that his life was just horrible. And he started to recognize some of the virtues that he saw in this man's life. You survived, and you did it with persistence, and you learned from the situations so that you could move forward. And, you were a loyal gang member, right? So he started to find all these different virtues. And of course, this guy, no one had ever told him anything positive about himself. So he had never had anyone mirror his virtues back to him. And then my husband asked him, would you like to know a tool that I've been teaching some of the other prisoners? And this guy said, yeah, sure. What is it? I may not use it, but what is it? So my husband said, well, there's this thing called the sparkle technique. As soon as you start to feel mad, you look to the right and smile and sparkle, and then look to the left and smile and sparkle. Now, imagine saying this to this guy, right? The guy burst out laughing. He said, that's a bunch of bullshit. And my husband said, fine, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. So the guy lived his life for a week, and then he saw my husband again, and he came up to my husband, bouncing his steps. He was all excited, and he said, I want to tell you that this sparkle shit really works. I'm teaching all the guys how to sparkle to the right and sparkle to the left and smile, and we haven't had any fights all week. And so that is the power of virtues to affect people. When you start mirroring back the qualities of their soul to them, and then give them a little tool, like the sparkle technique, right? Any little tool, and mirror the qualities of their soul back to them, you will see beautiful, sustained changes. It might not be there all at once. It will need to grow like a plant in an ecosystem, but it still will be there. So I hope you like our story about how soul-sustaining virtues can be very helpful, and how learning the language of virtues is going to help you at work and everybody else at work too. So here's my question to you. Which of the soul-sustaining tools that I provided spoke to you the most? And which one would you like to try first and see what it can be like? So I challenge you to try one of the virtues tools that I presented. And if you enjoyed this particular episode, I hope you will share it with a friend, because I would like more people to hear about how they can have happier workplaces. That's my mission in life. So if you enjoyed this episode, I would love to hear from you. To leave your thoughts, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and scroll to the box in the middle that says, I would love to hear from you. Just click on either voice message or text message and leave your message. You don't have to go through any other apps or platforms. It's pretty quick. And if you're finding these episodes insightful and you do not yet have the book, you can purchase The Spirit of Work, Timeless Wisdom, Current Realities online on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or directly from my website, shiftworkplace.com. You will see a big sign on the top of the website that says, buy the book. And that's how you'll know you're in the right place. Thank you for listening. And may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Newsflash! Listeners can now interact with Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by leaving a voice or text message on Fan List. It is a fun and quick way to let me know what you liked, ask a question, or leave a suggestion. I will feature some of the voice messages on upcoming episodes. You might be surprised to hear your own voice, but only if you leave a message, of course. So to leave your personal message or your question, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and click on the Fan List link to leave it. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.